Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I know we've got a bunch of people online watching. Welcome to everyone there, too. We're going to be talking about the future today. And most of it's going to be around AI, generative AI, and how that's going to be impacting creative workflows. There we go. Hi. My name is Brooke. I am a principal designer on the Machine Intelligence and New Technologies team at Adobe. That is a mouthful, but it basically just means that I am behind a lot of the teams who are working on AI-first features at Adobe. It's a very exciting thing. And Adobe. I've been there for 9 years, almost 9 years, and I've had the opportunity to work on some really cool stuff. I've been up here in Seattle many times, working with Microsoft. I helped them develop the haptics for the Surface Pen 2. I've also had the opportunity to work with Apple quite a bit for drag and drop on the iPad. But I've been a career designer, except for like 2 years in high school when I thought I was going to go into finance. Clearly, that did not pan out. All right. So before we get started, I will warn you, I have taken the liberty of putting the most cheesy graphics I can find in here, so please enjoy. So let's break it down a little bit. Over the past 2 years, AI has become pretty much a household name, if we're going to be honest. I think I hear everyone talking about AI, and many people, maybe including some people in this room and some of the people online, are nervous about how it's going to affect their jobs. And I think that's an understandable thing, definitely understandably so. So I believe knowledge is key, and so we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about, for example, AI, Gen AI, machine learning, what's the difference between all of those. And we have to remember that, as Natalie mentioned earlier, this stuff has been around for decades. And so we're going to see a few examples of what those are. Before that, I had to share some of my favorite early Gen AI examples. The first one, I think, is from Dolly. It's Freddie Mercury in a washing machine eating ramen. And the second one is actually my all-time favorite prompt to use when I'm testing Gen AI features, which is acrobats on bikes doing tricks. Gen AI has no idea what to do, and it essentially explodes. So let's dive in really quickly to AI, which is artificial intelligence. So what is artificial intelligence? It is machines essentially simulating human thinking processes. So for example, learning, processing, problem solving, and language understanding. One of the very first examples of using AI was actually detecting the numbers on bank checks. So this has been around, as Natalie mentioned, for forever and ever. Use it every day, and you probably don't even realize it. Another one of my favorite examples is spell check. Who here uses spell check? If you don't have your hand raised, you should. Everyone uses it. And then also, of course, because I work at Adobe, many of you who use Photoshop, Illustrator, all of our other tools, you're using AI. AI is a tool you use in your workflow every day when you get inside of Adobe Apps, and you probably didn't even realize it. And then the last one is Face ID. So if you're using your face to open your phone, you're using AI. The next one is machine intelligence. So how is machine intelligence different from AI? Machine intelligence is essentially a subset of AI. So AI is sort of like the whole big group, and then machine intelligence is within that. And it's literally teaching a machine how to perform a specific task. So let's take a look at some of the examples of machine intelligence. Spotify, recommendations, anything that's recommending you, that's machine learning. If you're using Siri, Alexa, or Google, that's machine learning. And early detection in the medical industry is also machine learning. So learning processes and procedures. Then there's also something called deep learning, which is essentially multiple layers of neural networks, or AI, being taught a concept. One of those things is medical diagnostics. Probably one of the most common ones is language recognition or speech recognition. So again, that's a more specific subset of machine learning, which is deep learning. And then again, one of my favorite examples, I'm from San Francisco. I don't know if any of you saw this or heard this, but there was the Cruise cars or the Waymo cars, and people were putting cones on top of them because that was interrupting the machine learning process. It was saying, uh-oh, there's something in front of me, stop. And so there was a protest where people were going around putting codes on all the cars. It was a disaster, I have to tell you. And then the last one, Gen AI, which is a subset of machine learning. So you have all of these different layers of AI, and Gen AI is one of the ones that's in the center. And generative AI is essentially a subset of AI that trains machines to generate new content based on the data that you've trained it on. And that's where we get into all the different things. So let's talk about what we just shared here and all the different concepts. So this should give you a pretty good visual of how all of this ties together. So AI is the overall big concept, machine learning is second, deep learning, and then Gen AI. That's kind of how it all fits together. I like this graphic because, again, it's kind of my pet peeve when people are like, AI, AI. It's been around forever. Gen AI is usually what a lot of people are talking about when they're talking about some of their fears around creative workflows and what's happening. And so I just want to give you that visual image of what that is. And then LLMs. We're not really going to talk about that a lot today, but there's LLMs and there's GPTs. GPTs are a subset of LLMs. We won't get into it, but there are differences between those two. And LLMs, essentially, are also not new. The first chatbot, which is an LLM, was created in 1960, and it was called Eliza. And GPT is what we know of today, which is ChatGPT, again, generative models. So, one of my favorite quotes from Oveta Sampson, if you haven't listened to anything that if you haven't heard of her, go on YouTube, watch one of her talks. She's amazing. One of my favorite things that she says is, data is the love language of machines, and data comes from humans, and humans are biased. Therefore, the data from these machines can be biased. So I want to talk about some of the issues behind what we see with a lot of these generative AI models. This is another way to put some of this. It's a longer quote, but I think if you've all used LLMs or if you used ChatGPT, you'll notice it cannot be trusted. Essentially, it is not there to give you facts. It is there to make suggestions. It is there to give you options. And I love this quote because the last part of it, it says, they can't distinguish between fact and fiction. Their currency is the probabilistic relationship between words. And many of the content that they put out turns out to be confidently worded truth. So don't ever look to GPT for facts. So let's get into where some of the problems with all of this start. And the first one that I'm going to get into, which is one that everyone here should probably be pretty familiar with, is that a lot of these generative AI models are trained on data taken from the web. How many of you here have an online portfolio? Great. Your data was taken to train a lot of the visual generative models that are out there. And the problem with that is that none of us necessarily gave consent to having models trained on our data. Now, there are quite a few companies out there who have reasons why they feel like it's okay. The first one being that, if we compensated copyright holders for this content, they wouldn't get much money anyway. The second argument is AI training is just like reading a book. There's a second argument about why it's okay to do this. The third one is using the data is merely an intermediate step to generating outputs. So we'll talk a little bit about how generative AI works. Essentially, it takes content which is training data, which most often is from the web. It destroys it, and then it adds noise to create new content. Now, that is a hugely oversimplified explanation of how this works. If there's any engineers in the crowd who have all the details, don't judge me. I'm a designer. But then the fourth one is training on copyright content falls under fair use. So those are some of the arguments as to why some of the companies feel like it's okay to train on any data that's on the web. Now let's get into the part about hallucination. So this is what it calls when the generative AI models create new content. We call it hallucination. And again, as I mentioned before, essentially it takes all of the training data, it destroys that data, then it adds noise to create new data. Again, an oversimplification. But let's look at what some of the problems are once you actually start doing this. So we don't see this quite as often anymore, but one of the things, and one of the reasons why a lot of artists were really, really upset, is in some of the early work is the AI was actually adding signatures, essentially, to the work. Based on all the training data, it noticed that there were signatures on many pieces of work in a specific location, and so it started adding, basically, an AI signature to all the content. Again, pretty problematic. This is the Oveta Samson quote that I mentioned before. Data is the love language of machine learning, but we must remember that that data is not true. And I think that this is one of the things that will help us remember where we are and what we're dealing with, and we'll get into that in a second. So, one of my favorite prompts. This is a very old one. But with great power comes great responsibility. And this is where I'm going to talk about a little bit about the data and the love language of machines, which is data which is not true. And if you're wondering, I work for Adobe, as I mentioned, and we have a generative AI model called Adobe Firefly. We'll get into it. This is one of the early examples of what it was outputting. It no longer does that, in my opinion, unfortunately. Don't tell anyone that. All right, let's get into some of the issues of the great power comes great responsibility. So this is recent. This was from 2 weeks ago. I went to Midjourney, one of the AI models sites, and I just literally took the most recent, 6 set of images that had been generated. Does anyone notice anything? Everyone here is white. That's a problem. That's a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's not showing any sort of diversity. That's the smallest problem. The second problem is that because the model has been trained on data from the web, that means the web is pretty white, right? And so what generative AI does is it not only takes the content that it's learning from, but it also perpetuates that. So it perpetuates the lack of diversity. It takes that and it finds patterns in the stuff that's already out there, patterns that maybe humans don't necessarily see, and it makes those patterns more apparent. So this is a harm and bias issue. This is just a very simple one, but it's a really big problem. And it's a problem that I know a lot of people are working to help mitigate, but it's still a problem. Control and consistency. So can I get a set of hands? How many of you have used any of the Gen AI models? Midjourney, Runway, DALL-E? Okay, most of you. How many of you get what you want out of it? You don't have to take it into Photoshop. You don't have to take it anywhere to do anything with it. You can use it right away. A few of you. Okay, cool. So one of the things that I've found is when I'm generating content, and this is something that we hear pretty consistently, is I need more control over it. I can't get the consistency I want. I generated the animal or the character or the person or the object, whatever it was. I generated it, but now I need that in 12 different scenes, and I can't get that consistently. So that's one of the issues that a lot of people are dealing with. And so it's really fun when you want to generate just like something one-off. I actually do this a lot with, I have 2 kids. I have a 5-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. But my daughter loves generating content. And then what she likes to do is she likes to take it and then, draw from it. But the problem is very rarely does she actually get the thing that she wants. She's very into unicorns right now. And like the unicorn is never the unicorn that she had in her mind. And so that's a very simplified example. But, you can imagine when you're trying to do this, for your company, or you're trying to do it for an illustration in a book or something like that. Like the ability to get consistent results is really difficult. Additionally, and a lot of models are moving away from this, is there's a specific prompting language. Now, we're not hearing about this quite as much anymore because places like Midjourney and DALL-E and Stable Diffusion are moving away from that pretty crazy prompting language. But this is still a really long prompt. Like you have to know really pretty specifically and in detail what it is that you're trying to get in order to get an output. So that's another barrier to entry. And then there's issues with truth in advertising. So one of the things is that, if you work in an agency, truth in advertising is a big deal. You have to show the exact thing that it is that you're selling. There's lawsuits out the wazoo about like truth in advertising issues. And so this is a BMW M5, I believe, M5, that was generated, as it says it in the prompt. Yeah, BMW M5. So it was generated, and like on the outside, it looks pretty good. But we see a problem with the logo. That's pretty easy to fix, right? Like there's technology to do that, no big deal. There's issues with the grill, a little bit more difficult to fix. You can probably take care of that in Photoshop. And then there's issue like this. I mean, yes, we do have self-driving cars, but not sure I would recommend that. And so that's why, and I'm going to get into a little bit about what I'm doing at Adobe. That's why I believe all this stuff actually needs to be built into the tools that you're using every day. And I'm going to go into a little bit about Adobe Firefly. So Adobe Firefly, and this is my marketing pitch, and I'll be done. We'll keep moving on with the presentation. Adobe Firefly was trained on Adobe stock and content that Adobe has licensed to use. We also we have a contributor model for our stock. We have a compensation model for our stock contributors. And so not only do we pay them when someone purchases their images on stock, we've also compensated them for use of the training data that we use to train the model. And this is really important to us because we believe, number one, not just we, but like and I say this very openly, I would not be working at Adobe doing what I was doing if I didn't believe in the way that we were doing this. It's very important to me. And so, yeah, we believe that we should own or have the rights to use or have license to use all of the content that our model is trained on. And additionally, it needs to show up in the workflow. So in Photoshop, how many of you have used generative fill in Photoshop? A few of you. If you haven't, it's fun to play around with. Like, quite honestly, one of my favorite things to do is, and this had a moment on social where you would, you upload the Beatles album cover, and then you use something we call generative expand, which is basically, you expand the crop or the width of the image, and it essentially like hallucinates what else is in the picture. Yeah, there was a whole moment of it on social of album covers. It's super fun. But as you can see here, using it in the workflow allows me to use it in the tools that I do stuff in every day. So I'm already compositing in this example in Photoshop, and I can use it to help me in that compositing process. Or in Illustrator, we have a generative vector model. I can use it directly in my workflow to help me add elements. Now, there's a couple things here. Like, vector's super hard, right? And we're still working on it, but like if I, for the OG Illustrator people here, if I command Y so I can see all the outlines, like there's a lot of cleanup to do for sure. So these are things like it's still like it's helpful in the workflow, but it's still not the end all be all. And it's not always going to get me where I want. And I think this is true for all generative visual models. This is another example, as I mentioned, we trained on content that we have licensed to use. That means Firefly doesn't know things like Super Mario. It doesn't know things like SpongeBob. It doesn't know things like BMW M5. Why is that helpful? Well, that's helpful because brands then can have the control to train a model on top of Firefly that only knows, the BMW M5. So if I have a model that was trained on Mercedes and Ford and Audi, and BMW, it's taking all that information and it's essentially dirtying the data to get me an M5. But with Firefly, it doesn't know any of those things, and so I can teach it more specifically how to generate exactly what I want. And then the last thing is just content credentials. You can actually turn these on in any of our tools, but it essentially keeps track of who the owner is, the edits that you've made to the file, and all of this is around content provenance. So what is content provenance? Content provenance is essentially making sure whoever has license to use this or whoever did something to it, their name is attached to it. We also have something called the Content Authenticity Initiative. We just had, I think it was OpenAI join it a couple weeks ago, which is very exciting, which is essentially we want to make sure that creators' names are tied to what they're creating. So we have this site. It's actually really cool. You can go to the URL is contentcredentials.org/verify. You can upload any photo, and you can check to see if there's other content out there that matches that. It will also tell you, was this thing generated in Firefly? Was it generated in Midjourney? Where did it come from? And then it also works for screenshots, which is pretty amazing. So definitely recommend checking it out. And then all this to say is there's more coming. I can't say a whole lot about that, but as you can imagine, we have a vector model, we have a design model that you can use in Adobe Express to generate templates. We have generative fill in Photoshop. You can imagine there is a lot more coming. So what do humans do and what do machines do and how are they different and how can we take advantage of this? All right, so the printing press, we're going to take a quick look at technology. So the printing press, people were against it because they were afraid of widespread misinformation. The camera, artists were afraid to use it, or if they did use the camera, early technology camera, they were afraid to use it because they didn't want people to think that they were faking their work. So that's where some of the art movements came from. This Vertigo, hopefully this is familiar to most of you, this is the example of the first animated, digitally animated sequence. And a lot of illustrators and animators were really concerned when digital animation came around because they thought they would be out of jobs. What actually happened is the people who adopted digital animation actually became pros and masters of the tool, and they became better at doing it than anyone else. So they still had their jobs. Let's talk a little bit about design history. So one of the things that I get excited about when I talk about this is that there's, as I mentioned, there's stuff that machines do really well, and there's things that humans do really well. The thing that machines don't know about is they don't know about what our human experiences are. They can learn, after some time, some of the social and political and cultural changes that are happening. But it requires the humans to experience those things before the machine can learn it. Some of the examples of this, of the social, political, cultural events happening in the world changing design, is constructivism. So this was a rejection against freedom, basically. But they were wanting to know that there was equality. This was meant to represent building and science and very specific learned things. And so the design language started reflecting that. Another example is Memphis design style. This was a rejection of the modernism and minimalism of the 60s and 70s, of the early 60s and 70s. And so this is when the Memphis style came about. So as you can see, there's sort of these reactions to things that are happening in the world that cause design movements and design aesthetic changes. So let's get into what machines do best. They are amazing at recognizing and repeating patterns. So things like button states. I'm sure everyone loves making sure that they have the correct button state in every single case. Not me. Like, it would be amazing if generative AI or AI could just take care of this for me. If I don't have the right button state, amazing. I don't have to think about it. Like, just change it for me, please. Or give me the button states. It doesn't matter. Like, I just don't want to deal with it. AI can help us with that. Interpreting and responding to data. So things like analytics, how things are performing, how is your app performing. It can make recommendations based on patterns and data that it's seeing, so we don't have to take the time to sort of synthesize it ourselves manually. And then repetitive tasks. So I used to work at an agency. My agency was a digital agency for Johnson & Johnson, baby. I cannot tell you, and this is totally dating me, but I cannot tell you how many times I had to animate the same baby crawling across the screen in Flash on different sizes of ads, like web banners. Like, these are things that AI can do for us, and that's the thing that I'm excited about. So what do we as humans do best? We feel. We can be spontaneous. Emotions are spontaneous. We react to things. This is something the machines don't do. They can't feel. They don't have the human experience. Getting into experience, we view our lives through subjective lenses. I have a different view of the world than every single person out here. Every single person out here has a different view of every other person. That's the amazing thing about it, is we have a point of view, and it's subjective. And we can reflect. This is another one that I love. I think as designers and creators, a lot of us spend time reflecting. We look back at what we've done, and we think about what could be better, what could we do different. Machines do that from a very, very specific data-driven lens, and that can be really amazing. But from a creative perspective, reflection is super important. And we break the rules. Like, we know what the rules are. The machine can't break the rules. The machine just keeps following the rules. We can decide at random, spontaneously, to break those rules, and that's amazing. Let's talk a little bit about the future and what that looks like. One of the things I'm super excited about for generative AI is for accessibility. You know, right now, there are a lot of people out there that want to be creative and do creative tasks and do creative things, and they can't because they're limited. I'm excited about what the possibilities can be with generative AI. A really, really simple example are, keyword tags or tooltips on a website, or alt tags, metadata. A lot of websites don't have that content. Maybe generative AI can generate that content for me on the fly, so I can navigate the website that I want to navigate. Things could become multidimensional. Now we're getting into like really speculative territory here, so play along with me. But one of my dreams is to be able to interact on a canvas that is, it doesn't matter what media I want to use, I can use it. It doesn't matter, what is it 3D, is it 2D, is it 4D? It's all of the things. Like, that would be amazing. And generative AI can help us do things like that. It just opens up the world of possibilities to be able to work in dimensions or work in ways that I'm not super familiar with, and allow me to do things I wouldn't have been able to do previously. And immersive, and this is like super speculative territory, but like, imagine you go to a museum, you look at the piece. There are, I'm totally blanking on her name now, the woman that makes all the dot work, that was in San Francisco, and I went to the experience. Like, it is an immersive experience, but it's still immersive. I'm still viewing it. The artist and the viewer are separate. But what happens when the artist and the viewer can start interacting with each other? What happens when I become part of the artwork? There's lots of different possibilities here that get really exciting once you start thinking about it. And then I'm going to stop here, but I just want to end on, to be human is to be creative. And I hope that's what you all take away from here, is machines can do a lot of amazing things. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, but I do honestly believe that we can change the direction of, if this is going down a path that it shouldn't. We're artists and we're designers. We're people that are using it. We've already seen this happen. There's lawsuits that have gone to the Supreme Courts about this kind of stuff. There's a lot of conversations about copyright. And I think that as artists and designers, we can stand up and we can have a say in the direction this goes. And I hope all of you feel the same way about this as I do. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions.
Hi, thank you so much. Great talk. Really enjoyed that, especially the Boston Terrier image in the middle there. You mentioned early on about like creator compensation and like content compensation. I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that. Like, what were some of the discussions around determining what that looked like? Is it a blanket application for all content, or does it fluctuate depending on various factors? What were kind of some of the metrics you guys thought about?
That is an amazing question. I would have to direct you to the people who made that decision in order to answer that question. So I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to it.
We do have a question from the chat, and the following question is, what is some ways UX research can meaningfully contribute to the future in the development and training of AI tools and models?
That's a really good question. I'm a little bit unsure. I'll answer it in a couple ways. So how can the design of UX?
Yeah, so as a UX researcher, how can we contribute for the future of AI, basically?
Got it. I think that like as a UX researcher, there's a lot of opportunity here. Right now, we're seeing that creative workflows are being kind of redefined. Like we're just starting to see the beginning of it. But once generative AI becomes a part of people's workflows, as they volunteer to adopt those things, patterns are going to have to change. And that's UX patterns are going to be one of the first things. Like we're already seeing that at Adobe. We have a design language that we go by, and we're already having to make updates and changes to it based on the type of generative features that we're adding to it. The standard sort of UX patterns don't always make sense. And so that's what, candidly, design research has been instrumental in us developing some of this stuff. I'm working on something right now that we're having to totally rethink the way that we thought that we were going to design this thing because the standard patterns aren't working. And so that's where design research is going to be super instrumental in helping make sure that these are good experiences. Great question.
Can you talk about how did you transition from doing non-AI related work to doing AI related work? Did you go to school for it, or what was your journey like?
I said I wanted to do it. I know that's a terrible answer, but so I've kind of gone back and like I started out my career as a web designer. I'd never designed a website in my life. I mean, this I'm not going to tell you what year this is because it'll tell you how old I am. But I'd never designed a website, and so I started out in web design. Like as the web was sort of like more companies were wanting websites and having an online presence. And then I'd gone to school for graphic design, and I really wanted that experience. And so I transitioned over to agency, where I was a graphic designer for a while. And then I went to grad school just because I love school and I'm curious about things. And then I came to Adobe after that. And really what I think that to get into AI, I'll put it this way. When I hire on my team, I don't necessarily look for AI experience. I'm not super interested in that, candidly. I'm interested in someone who can show that they can be creative, they're curious. Curiosity is actually the #1 thing that I look for, and they're willing to be collaborative. I think there's techniques and things that can be learned. AI workflows can be learned. And honestly, sometimes I think having a prior knowledge of AI can be a detriment because you have this way of thinking that you want to follow. And we're so early on that I think there's just new ways of working and new ways of thinking that having previous AI experience is not necessary, in my personal opinion. I don't know that everyone agrees with me, but that's my opinion.
Okay, you ready?
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Brooke. This talk was super approachable. I was curious, I was glad you mentioned accessibility and you framed it mostly as an opportunity, which I think is very exciting. But as you've been developing these tools, can you talk about some of the challenges and how have you made sure that these generative tools are accessible?
That is a super difficult question. I mean, I think that's one that everyone is struggling with because, as I mentioned before, it's a new technology, which brings its own set of challenges. It's new patterns. So, for example, you know, like alt tags on images that are generated. Like, candidly, I think if you go to firefly.com, I don't think there's any alt tags on the images because those would have to be generated. And so there's just a lot of accessibility opportunities, and that's where I was mentioning, you know, maybe AI can help us generate on the fly. You know, there's image descriptors where you can put in an image and it will describe the image to you. And so I think that there's just so many opportunities for us to make not only Gen AI accessible for people who, you know, have a different ability, but to make creativity as a whole accessible. So I don't know if I answered your question completely, but like, I'm agreeing with you. Yes, there's a ton of opportunity, and I think that like, I think we're just scratching the surface on challenges that we've been getting into. I think we have some questions up here at the front.
What's your opinion on people who are not in the creative industry having access to being able to generate things with AI and generate their own images and content, how that will play out on the content landscape of what we're seeing and how that kind of feeds back into training the models?
That is an amazing question. First of all, I think it's awesome that people who maybe haven't had the tools or knowledge to be creative or you know, first of all, I think it's a misnomer that there's creative people and non-creative people. I personally think that everyone is creative. But I think it's amazing that people can be visually creative who felt like they couldn't be before. I think that's amazing. I think second of all is, as I mentioned before, you know, what we're doing is we're building this into the tools that creatives use every day. And so just like I mentioned with digital animation, animation didn't go away. We don't have bots making animation. Maybe we will soon, I don't know. But like, the people who learned the tools became the power users. They learned how to do it better than anyone else. And I think that that's something that we're gonna see happening, and we're already seeing happening. I mean, within Adobe, I can, you know, we can say, make a picture of a dog running in a field, you know, generate an image, and you know, loosely you put everyone into categories. Like, designers as a whole are going to be able to they are prompting better images of a dog running in a field than the engineers are, and that's nothing against engineers. We have a ton of creative engineers who are amazing prompters at Adobe, but like, again, putting things into categories, like there's people learn how to use the tools that are using them every day. And then there was another part of your question that I'm totally forgetting. Democratizing creativity, people using it. What was the other part of your question?
Hello? Oh, okay. Yeah, it democratizes it and people are able to create that content, and then it creates a content landscape that the models then get trained off. So
right.
How do you see that?
Right. Essentially, like the data that's being put out there being re-ingested into the AI models, which is another problem. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I love what I'm doing at Adobe, is that we don't scrape the web. And so we actually have a very specific curation process for curating the data that goes into our training models. So I'll give you an example. This is actually we have a Seattle office here, and it was probably like 7 or 8 months ago, we realized that we didn't have great crowd data in Adobe Stock or any of our licensed data. And so they threw a giant party because they needed to do better with like people and crowds, because what the AI was doing is it was sort of like mushing people together in crowds. And so now our crowd data is way better because we actually did our own photo shoots and you know, fine-tuned the model on crowds. And so I think that that's that's one of the things that more models are probably going to start doing. I know, everyone has their own methodology for doing things like that, but our data is highly curated, which, is a benefit, I believe.
So I think you just brought up something really interesting about kind of training your own models to try to fill the gaps maybe that other models might not have. What I wonder is, how do you feel about the power dynamic that now exists in tech companies where maybe only like a handful, maybe 3 to 10 companies have these power to pre-train their own models and maybe ask to get money to use it, as opposed to making those types of training tools available to let's say, democratize training as opposed to democratize access to tooling? Because I could see if a company was started in Africa that solved this exact problem, as opposed to started in America with a completely different set of models and possibly a different photo shoot, for that particular situation.
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And I think, there's a couple of things. So Stable Diffusion and OpenAI, you can use their models to fine-tune essentially your own models. I can't speak to Adobe's plans about doing that. I actually personally don't know. But I think you're bringing up an amazing point, which goes back into the harm and bias issue, right? Like, if the model wouldn't have originated in Silicon Valley, Tech USA, California, like, I'm sure those models could potentially have very different results. And I think that's the unfortunate part about all of this is, there's data comes from humans, and humans are biased. And all I can say, I guess, is that you're raising an amazing point, and I think it's something that we need to figure out how to address. One of the things that we've done on our end is we make sure that, say you type in, a woman in the desert, you actually get results of 4 different ethnicities of women. And so we've done a lot of harm and bias mitigation internally. All of our products that have Gen AI in them have to go through an AI ethics review, which is prompting to make sure that we're not putting out not just harmful content, but biased content, and making sure that we're doing a good job of representing. I'm not saying it's perfect every time, but we have an entire team dedicated that basically is part of whether or not you ship your feature if it has Gen AI in it. So I think it's an amazing question. I think these are big questions that we're going to all have to grapple with, and not just questions, but like issues that are going to become bigger as this becomes more widely adopted.
Brooke, the last question is from the chat. What problem is general AI solving in the UX space? So,
yeah, I think right now there are a lot of opportunities. One of the options that I shared here, which I think would be amazing, would be states of different components. Like that would be amazing. If I want to say I need to start I'm designing a new app or a new feature for an app, can I essentially say, hey, this is what it needs to have, and based on all the existing designs that we already have for this existing app, it sort of gives me a few options for where I can start. I think there's so many opportunities. I think we're going to see a lot happening most likely in the next year or two with UX. That's it? Okay, if you have other questions, feel free to come up to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to chat more. Thank you, everyone.